know you're watching. I know those are mine, and I'm gonna come and get them.
It's never gonna happen,
anyway,
bro.
In this flashback.
Nothing like my brother's manga. Or should I say, my manga.
What? Told you I was gonna be back for them.
What? What happened to my manga?
Told him I was gonna get my books. Where am I? Well, anyway, we're gonna look at book number 2 in the Blood Ravens Omnibus, Dawn of War Ascension. Now, before I go on with that book, let me talk about a short story that happens before that between this one and the first one. That short story is called Trial of Isidore. If you remember from my first review, I kind of mentioned that Isidore gets corrupted and he's turned. Apparently, some people were a bit confused as to why he did what he did. Personally, I was able to figure it out, but the story does give a little bit more insight into Isidore's actions. It pads out the book a little bit, but it's not a bad short story. But for me, it was unnecessary, but I'm sure for some people, it'll help. Anyway, back to book number 2. This book takes place directly after the first one, and it essentially carries over all of the main characters from the first one. Well, all the main ones that survived. And this story does carry on beyond the Dawn of War game. So there's a lot of stuff to go through, so let's not waste any time. The main premise of this book deals with both the Blood Ravens and the same Eldar from the last book. Now, in the last book, we were introduced to Farseer Maka, and she's getting some bad visions with something dealing with, and I know I'm going to destroy this pronunciation. Shatranio Shield is essentially a protection spell around this one planet trying to contain this great evil. But the other exarchs of her army don't really believe her, because these kind of visions could be false. And by coincidence, Gabriel Angelos is on his way to a planet called Rahi's Paradise, or Race Paradise. I'm not really sure. Which just happens to be the same planet Maka's getting the same visions from. And there is a very nice subplot dealing with a character called Krias. You figure it out. Who was a little bit of a side character in the last story. Now, to quickly move on to the characters, I want to start off with that guy who I just mentioned. In the last book, he was a young Imperial Guardsman who has the honor of trying to become a Blood Raven. And throughout this entire story, they keep going back into the entire process of what every recruit needs to go through to become a Blood Raven. Well, an Adeptus Astartes, a Space Marine. Mainly all the surgery they have to go through to implant all the organs, and the very brutal process that any recruit needs to go through, that the surgery itself could just outright kill most of them. And I really enjoyed that little bit of story, explaining what it really takes to become a Space Marine, and the entire process on each recruit. It really gives you more of a respect on anybody who survived the process. And moving on, we have good old Gabriel Angelos, always the main character in these books. And of course, his special psychic senses keep giving him a hint that he needs to go to Rahi's Paradise. And he goes there alongside his regular command squad. Among them is Tantius, his second in command, who was in the first book but plays a much bigger part in this book. In this book, we're introduced to librarian Jonas, who helps Gabriel trying to uncover the secrets of Rahi's Paradise. And now on the flip side, we have the Eldar. I already mentioned Farseer Maka. In the last book, she tried to help guide Gabriel through his actions and ultimately had her plans backfire. So in this book, she's not really too happy with Gabriel, but again, she is forced to work along with him. Finally, we have Laresh, who's a Dark Reaper who accompanies the Farseer. And I just want to give a quick shout out to a minor character, Chaplain Elizer. Nothing? Where's Celia? I guess I might have jump cut too far. Anyway, he does play a small role, but he does give hope that there might be a Chaplain Dreadnought eventually in the series. Well, hope which is not fulfilled, because a Chaplain Dreadnought would just be way too awesome.
Chaplain!
Booyah! Anyway, the Farseer, along with Laresh, go to Rahi's Paradise to find out what's going wrong. You see, the other exarchs who are with her didn't really believe her, because there was another battle going on that they knew was going to happen, and the Farseer's predictions weren't always 100% true, so they didn't quite believe what was going on, except for Laresh. And of course, when they get there, they find a Blood Raven outpost. The outpost which is being run by librarian Jonas. And in this outpost, they're pretty much digging up relics that they're finding underneath. These relics, which might have some significance into finding out the Blood Raven's history. But of course, they end up finding out something far more dangerous. Something which, if you haven't guessed it, the Eldar are trying to stop them from finding. Now, when Gabriel Angelos shows up, he's initially there to try to get recruits for the Blood Ravens. But it turns out the Eldar are killing off all the Psykers they find, or anyone with potential Psyker ability. But really, they didn't need to go that far to piss off the Blood Ravens. So in this book, you have some pretty interesting battles going on, in which the Blood Ravens fighting the Eldar. But the Ravens are not led by Gabriel, because he's off on another mission. So that's when the Terminator Sergeant Tantius takes over. And you get a pretty interesting battle between a Terminator Space Marine against a Dark Reaper Eldar. But then you have another plot dealing with unconventional allies between the Farseer Maka and Gabriel Angelos. Because throughout all the excavation Librarian Jonas was going through, they do find some pretty suspicious stuff. And I really don't want to ruin too much. It does feed on a little bit to the entire mystery behind the Blood Raven's history on how much significance what they find might actually have. Or it could be a complete red herring. And it is a bit of an interesting relationship between Maka and Gabriel. Because they are sworn enemies and they do want to kill each other, and there are reasons for them to kill each other. But in order for them to find out the truth, they have to work with each other. So you end up with really awkward scenes when they're trying to be friends, or they appear they might be friends or friendly. When in just a few scenes after that, they're trying to kill each other when they're at each other's throats. But then they're friends again, and then they're enemies, then they're friends, and then enemies. But I think they balance it out fairly well, but not perfectly well. In fact, I do get the impression that C.S. Goto might end up running a tabletop Eldar army, because he does greatly favor the Eldar. In fact, in a lot of battles, it does seem the Eldar have the upper hand, but the Blood Ravens win because they're the Blood Ravens, and this is their story, so they have to win. So really, the Eldar seem superior in every way, but somehow they just can't win. I found it a little bit irritating, but believe me, it gets worse in the next book, but we'll get to that next week. Well, I guess with my opinion on Dawn of War Ascension, I like what they do with trying to expand the story beyond the first Dawn of War game. I like on how they give more emphasis to some of the side characters, and you really get to know Gabriel Angelos a lot more, especially how he's kind of the troublemaker for the Blood Ravens. And I do like how they try to flush out more on the Eldar. You get to know them a lot more than you did in the first book. And the entire subplot with that guy, on his entire transformation into becoming an Adeptus Astartes, I found really interesting. But of course, that doesn't get resolved until the end of the next book. But really, it's the relationship between the Eldar and the Blood Ravens, and particularly Maka and Gabriel. I didn't really understand what was going on between them. There's definitely a love-hate relationship. They definitely don't trust each other, but they're constantly drawn to each other, like they need each other. And I wasn't really buying it. But with those gripes aside, it wasn't a bad story. If you read the first book, I would recommend the second book. It's not perfect by any means, but for any Blood Ravens fans, I will definitely recommend it. Now, those are
Ha! There you go. Give me back
my opinion,
manga.
taken for what it's worth.